เอาละค่ะในช่วงต่อไปค่ะเรียกได้ว่าการเสวนาของเราเป็นหัวข้อที่น่าสนใจมากๆแล้วเราก็ได้รับเกียรติค่ะจากท่านวิทยากรมากมายหลายท่านเลยค่ะซึ่งมินนะคะจะขออนุญาตส่งมอบเวทีต่อให้กับดร.เจษฎาสาราทองค่ะวันนี้นะคะทุกท่านจะมาเสวนาค่ะในหัวข้อ Vocational Education Preparing Students with Special Needs for Career a Global Perspective ขอกราบเรียนเชิญทุกท่านเลยค่ะ
ครับสวัสดีครับ Good afternoon everyone Good afternoon from Bangkok นะครับก็ขอบคุณพิธีกรนะครับที่ส่งต่อมาให้ผมนะครับสำหรับหัวข้อในวันนี้อย่างที่ทางพิธีกรได้บอกไปแล้วนะครับว่าเป็นหัวข้อที่เราจะบรรยายเราจะมีการพูดคุยกันเป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะครับดังนั้นเดี๋ยวผมจะขออนุญาตนะครับสวิตช์นะครับเปลี่ยนเป็นภาษาอังกฤษเพราะว่าแขกที่มาร่วมกับเราในวันนี้เนี่ยนะครับจะเป็นชาวต่างชาติถึง3ท่านด้วยกัน Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Bangkok. I'm Jesada Salatong from Chulalongkorn University. I would like to welcome all of you to our afternoon session, Vocational Education Preparing Students with Special Needs for Career, a Global Perspective. As the name says, a global perspective. So I'm very pleased to be your MC in this afternoon because we have a very truly global and international guest speakers and panelists from 4 countries together with us. So not to further ado, I would like to introduce each of our panelists. The first one, she just finished her talk on the case study on Thailand, but she will join us again for the panel discussion. Ms. Sawalak Thongkui, member of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2021-2024. สวัสดีครับ Okay. And the second one, our speaker from Australia, Professor Eva Stranadova from University of New South Wales, Australia. And then we have our guest speaker from Ireland, okay, from down under to Europe. We've got Assistant Professor Geraldine Scanlon from Dublin City University, Ireland. Hi. Okay, and come to China, closer to Thailand. We've got Associate Professor Tin Si Su or Dr. Tim from Central China Normal University, China. Okay, these are our distinguished 4 panelists who will join the panel with us this afternoon. So I would like to start from the situational report on the situation of disabilities in each country. Since we've already listened to Kun Sawalak already, so I will skip Thailand's situation and Thailand's case. I would like to start our afternoon session with the case and situation from Australia. So I would like to pass the floor to Professor Eva, please.
I'll just share with you my PowerPoint. Give me a moment. So hello everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium. I feel very honored to be one of the panelists. As I was introduced by Jess, I work as a professor at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and my field is special education and disability studies. At the beginning of this presentation, I would like to do what is traditional in Australia, that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that my university sits on, the Gadigal and Bediga people of the Eora Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live, which are the Camaraikal people. In today's presentation, I was asked to talk about the situation in Australia, both from the perspective of legislation and also from the perspective of the practice and what's happening in the schools. There is no specific legislation in terms of vocational preparation, or I will tackle today's topic from a more broader view, and that is really preparing the students for the transition from high school or from their schools to the post-school life. There is a strong legislation when it comes to the rights of students with disability. We have Disability Discrimination Act, which is from which result is disability standards for education, and the main theme going through the disability standards for education is that the students with disability should have access to education in its different aspects on the same basis as all other students. However, what's really nice to see in the current, these are not legislation pieces, but these are more policies and strategies and political as developing student agency, and we are talking here about all students, including students with disability. So this is example of the New South Wales new inclusive education statement for students with disabilities. And it also very much highlights the transitions from starting from school to transitioning to post-school life. Another important legislative guidance or policy guidance is a school excellence framework. And I have here just put a screenshot of one of its main focuses, which talks about the importance of transitions and started early in transitioning to the post-school life, and also, of course, preparing the students and collaborating with committees and communities and parents to achieve the successful transitions to post-school life and really prepare a student well. From another document looking into the future, there is again highlighted the recommendation that the students with disability should have access to work exploration and also have a post-school transition plan put in place. So these are very, very, very promising pieces of policies, and for me, a lot, because they really reflect what we know from research, that the students with disability very often miss out on a quality preparation and quality transitioning. And we also know that it is the self-determination and agency that is very often not developed in students with disabilities during their schooling. So very, very promising policy documents. There is also increasing focus on really utilizing the best practices for transition to the career and to post-school life more holistically. And within these best practices, there are 4 key things that are becoming very prominent. One is really focusing on 21st century transition and using and developing in students the 21st century skills. And this is very much coming from the work of Michael Wehmeyer from USA, which I knew we would be well acquainted with his work. As I said, increased focus on self-determination and self-determined learning. There is also increased encouragement of using evidence-based transition practices for students with disability, and also developing students' individual learning and transition plans. With the 21st century learning, this is really the main gist of it. I prepared a slide with a few bullet points. The focus is on developing the rich learning environments where all children are driven by their curiosity. It's about developing students' independence, initiative, self-direction. And again, while this is a beautiful ideal, I think we still have a lot to do in Australia when it comes to students with disability to achieve these ideals. In terms of self-determination and self-determined learning, there are definitely initiatives that are focused on developing these skills in students. In terms of evidence-based practices, there is now an increased again linking in teachers preparation, linking teachers to resources that have the evidence-based practices that they can use in their practice, especially those that are very relevant to transitions. We very much highlight in the teachers preparation the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. I have also put into my slides links, so you can actually connect to that, and I prepared a screenshot of the different evidence-based practices you can explore, all of them very relevant to what we are talking about with pre-employment transition services, post-secondary education, but also the important interagency collaboration between schools, students, teachers, and other stakeholders. Another great website with the transition evidence-based practices and other evidence-based practices, What Works Clearinghouse, and again I prepared some of the here a screenshot, and there is one that is very much specific to students who are on the autism spectrum. Again, the link is available and screenshot as well. All of these excellent resources, when you look at them, are based in America, from where most of the research on evidence-based practices, also in transitions, comes. So I must say that in Australia, it really much differs on who teaches the different pre-service and in-service teachers courses, and to what extent the teachers are encouraged to go and use these resources. So you would see a very differing quality in teachers preparation. Last but not the least, there is a really increasing focus on individual learning plans and individual transition plans. I just have to highlight though that in Australia, while these are not mandated by law, unlike, for example, in USA, or you can hear my accent, I'm originally from Czech Republic, there would be a mandate by law to have individual learning plans. So that's unfortunate. Because if you have these things mandated, then the law also specifies what should be included in these plans, and so while the individual learning plans appear in different schools, and we have now started with national consistent collection of data on school students with disability, which is important initiative, and schools to get the funding for the student need to provide specific evidence, and an example of evidence can be individual learning plans. So that gave a big incentive to schools to develop the individual learning plans, but the quality of these plans is also very varied, to say it nicely. So yeah, there is still a way to go, and there are things to improve. There is increasingly highlighted the need to include the student to be actively involved in all aspects of developing the and carrying on and revisiting the individual learning and transition plans. And indeed, especially in the New South Wales now, there are many exciting things happening in the Department of Education, where there is a big focus on student voice, students with disability having a voice in their education and a voice about how they want their future look like and how we get there. But there are still groups of students that are not really actively involved at all. And those are those groups of students, though chronically known internationally. So there is not much inclusion of students with intellectual disability or, for example, autism. So also another possible idea for improvement, as you can see. What is very successful initiative is Transition to Work program, which is initiative that has different forms, I know internationally as well. In Australia, works for young people aged 15 to 24, and it's usually a 2-year program preparing the students for very practical skills and linking them to community services or potential work opportunities. So this would be probably the short overview of what's happening in Australia, and with specific focus on New South Wales, because every state will have a bit different policies and guidances. I will now pass on to the next speaker.
Okay. Thank you so much for the comprehensive overview of the situation in Australia. Thank you so much. Okay, so we will get back to you later, but now I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Geraldine from Ireland, please. Hello, Dr. Geraldine? Hello?
Sorry, one moment. Yeah. Good
Okay.
morning.
Yeah, please, now the floor is
Sorry,
yours.
I keep saying good morning because it's morning here. So good afternoon. So I just put that up. Can you see my screen?
Hold on, but you can go ahead. Okay, so
I can go ahead.
Yep,
Okay.
please.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Okay. Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So good morning. Sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, delighted to be here.
Never mind about good morning. Okay.
I know. So my name is Dr. Ger Scanlon, and I'm based in Dublin City University in Dublin, but I'm in the Institute of Education. I'm a psychologist by trade. My research is very much embedded in a human rights perspective. So I've done an awful lot of work in the area of transition. And I'm really pleased to say that my research at the moment is informing national policy. So I'm going to actually present to you today the context of what's driving policy in Ireland at the moment. I suppose, like everywhere else in every other country in the world, because we've signed up and ratified the UN CRPD, it has been very much driven by the principle that people with disabilities are entitled to live independently. So this is a huge change, not only within the context in Ireland, but I also think universally, because traditionally we would have segregated people with disabilities from those who didn't have disabilities. And again, like Iva was saying there, it really does depend on the level of disability that you have. There is a huge emphasis here in Ireland on people with intellectual disability. So that's basically what we're going to look at today. Now, when we look at the policy context for further and higher education, there has been a recent strategy developed by our Department of Further and Higher Education. And just looking at statistics there, you'll see that there's 13,098 learners with disability in further education and training, and 14,358 learners with disability in higher education. What you don't see there is the profile, and the profile of people with disabilities between further education and training and higher education would be very different. We have a system that when you apply to university, that you can get assistance because of your disability. That can also be apparent in further education and training, but because of our very competitive system to get into university, which I'll show you in a moment, the profile can be very different. What's really interesting is that as a result of ratification of the UNCRPD, inclusion has become the buzzword across practically every department in the Irish government. And here, with this strategic goal, is to provide supports and opportunities for learning to all, recognising the needs of vulnerable learners and and most marginalised, and assist people to access progression through further higher education and training, so as to grow prosperity across communities and build social cohesion. So what you're actually seeing here is linking the whole notion of inclusion with access to further higher education to citizenship. The other policy context with which a lot of my work is embedded in is the comprehensive employment strategy that was actually launched in 2015. And this was developed to address historical barriers to employment, which arose from inadequate education and skills levels, low expectations, and also linked in with the loss of disability payments. So for example, in Ireland, when you are 16 years of age, you automatically receive a payment based on the fact that you have a disability. Again, what you're seeing here, and similar to the previous presentation, is really about building skills, capacity and independence, providing bridges and supports into work, making work pay. So what we find is an awful lot of people with disabilities who are trying to get back into work, or who are even trying to get work experience, end up doing an awful lot of volunteer work, and therefore really can't get proper work. Promoting job retention and re-entry into work, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Provide coordinated and seamless support and engage with employers. So what you're seeing there really are these what we would call bridges of transition. That's very much embedded within the literature about all of the different aspects that is required in order to get a person from A to B. What we are linked into in Ireland is the European framework of qualifications. And just what you see here is, very basically going from level 1 to a certificate right up to a PhD. Generally, we find that our students with special educational needs and disabilities are kind of between level 3 and level 4. But depending on what type of, final examination you do at level 4 will determine your progression. So your basic qualification here determines your access and your progression right through the framework of qualifications. I'll illuminate that a little bit more. So when we're looking at what we call post-school pathways within vocational education, in Ireland we have two systems of examination. The first is the Leaving Cert Applied, and this is very much in mainstream schools, not special schools, mainstream schools, whereby students with special needs do the alternative to the Leaving Cert, but it still will give them access to some opportunities. I will have to say at this point in time, in Ireland traditionally, students with disabilities didn't actually progress anywhere except to a sheltered workshop or community care or a national learning network, which is kind of a consortium of different workshops. So really, the progression from there would have been very terse, and that's what we would consider as our vocational educational section for people with disabilities. However, moving on then, you can see we have post-leaving certificate courses, and this is where education and training comes in. If you do the higher leaving certificate, which is highly competitive, you'll have to have a certain amount of points in order to access your higher education courses. So when we look at transitions, what does this look like? If you go to a mainstream school, you have what we would consider in Ireland to be a normative transition. Thereby, you go from school because you have actually attained either level 4 or level 5 within your qualifications, which gives you access to further education. Then you can go on to higher education, and hopefully that will lead you to employment. Unfortunately, transition from a special education school is much more fraught because you're only coming out with a level 3. So therefore, in order to even access further education and training, you must do another level 4 and a level 5 before you can access education and training. The same with higher education, obviously, or employment. And when we look at employment in the transition from special education as well, we note that these students don't have access to career guidance, don't have access to work experience, etc. They end up either in adult services, not going anywhere, and end up ultimately in unemployment. So what was the big game changer in Ireland for transition? Well, two things happened. The first thing that happened was that the Walk Peer organisation for people with intellectual disabilities developed a programme for young people who are in special schools to give them access and choice about where they would end up for the rest of their life. The second most important thing that happened at the same time was the comprehensive employment strategy had developed and was launched with a key vision of actually getting this program into place. So what you're seeing on your screen now is on your top line, we have what the Walk Peer model will do, okay? In year 1, they will engage with the young person and they'll say, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? What is your dream job? In year 2, then they progress that. They progress those aspirations and they develop those skills that's required in order to do that. That could be work experience, it could be literacy and numeracy, it could be lots of different types of things. Then we move into the actual transition. The person makes the transition to their destination of choice. Year 4, they're still supported by the program, and in year 5. Let me take you now down to the comprehensive employment strategy, which is talking about, which is talking about building capacity, skills and independence, providing bridges of support, making work pay, promote job retention. The Walk Peer model mirrors exactly what the comprehensive strategy has to do. What does this look like? So this is what we are proposing, is what is called a supported transition model. And this basically places the young person at the center of the model by building natural circles of support within their local communities. So it is about embedding and realising the aspirations and visions of the UNCRPD by retaining young people in their communities, whether or not that is access to vocational education or whether it's access to work experience. Really important, this young person is supported by a career and employment facilitator. And this person brings the young person with disabilities to a point in their lives that they can make an informed choice about their future, and thereby they are not consigned to a life of segregation in services. How this happens then is also supported by Key Strategic 5.1, which is legislation and policy within the government strategy, which identifies agencies and government departments that need to come together in order to support this young person for a seamless transition to happen. What does this career employment facilitator do? I will have to say that this role here is critical. They explore the aspirations of this young person. So again, going back to what Dr. Iva there was saying with regards to intellectual disability, this model has been developed for young people with intellectual disabilities. You raise their expectations, you raise them up to such a level that they develop those skills of self-determination and capacity making for decisions, etc. You develop the pathways. So the career employment facilitator literally goes out knocking on doors and finds out how and where the access can be, I suppose, achieved, and also particularly sustained. How can you support this young person? So this is a 5-year program. So what's really important here is to understand that transition does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen from the point that you're leaving to the point that you move to your next destination. It is a process. How this then actually facilitates transition is you're giving young people access, you're giving them choice, and this is all informing this whole notion of citizenship, which is underpinned by the UNCRPD. Finally, just to bring you up to date about the key findings from the research and policy. At the moment, the issue of transition from education for young people with special needs is really getting attention here in Ireland through the Comprehensive Employment Strategy Implementation Group, to which I have been presented research to. And there is a move to form a group to develop a holistic transition programme that will aim to support students to take the mainstream path to further and higher education, training and employment as the first option before looking at the disability centre option. And I want to stress that also many of our students in mainstream schools also end up with the disability centre. Two key pieces of research are informing both of these programs. The first one, which is the model that I've just presented to you, is the PACE report. And this is now helping to inform the Department of Education on how it might go about developing the program in collaboration with those government agencies that I referred to. And a second report, which I conducted in 2015 in some research, talks about transitions from education to employment for people with disabilities. And that's also been used by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability and Inclusion in Youth as the basis for conversation on a programme of supported employment for people with higher support needs. For example, mental health, which is the biggest I suppose, category of disability that is causing havoc across globally, not only internationally in Ireland. I have given you my email address there, and I've also provided a link where you can download all of the research that I've reported and the national reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the case study from Ireland. Okay, so now we will move to China. So I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Tim from China, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. And thanks for inviting me to join this session. I'm sharing my screen first. So can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, but can you make it bigger?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Okay,
here.
Okay, I will talk something about Chinese experiences. I'm Dr. Tianxi Xu. I'm an associate professor in Central China Normal University, and I will, show you a cartoon first. Actually, when I did my PhD, when I was reading an article, I saw this picture. I love this very much. I think perhaps even now it is still the case in many countries or in many areas. So when students with disabilities become graduated from the school, they may have low lifeguard and duties. So it is a very challenging period for students with disabilities if they would like to transition to adulthood with the quality of life. So today I will, share three themes. The first one is relative policies that supports vocational and transition education in China, and then some researches on the topic, and then some of the practices we are doing in China. And here are some of the recent policies and advocacies in China. Before I'm introducing those policies, I'd like to say that, actually from 1986 in China, we have introduced the 9-year compulsory education. During the compulsory education law in China, all students are entitled to receive 9-year compulsory education. So that's a base for most of the other education initiatives in China. And until recently, in 2014, 2017, and the central government introduced the 2 rounds of national special education promotion plans. And also, it's very similar in that document, the amendment of the regulation on education for individuals with disabilities in China. So those documents actually strongly still encourage and also stipulates that the education for students with disabilities should extend from each side I mean from early intervention, from non-compulsory education to early intervention, and also to secondary education. And within those documents, we also clearly stated that vocational education should be a priority area. And apart from those documents, we also have protection laws on individuals with disability and the regulations on the employment for individuals with disability. And also, recently, we introduced the guideline for promoting vocational education for individuals with disability, which was proposed by Ministry of Education and Ministry of Finance, and also China Disabled Persons Federation, etc. So, and those documents actually set out some of the frameworks for for resources relocation and personnel preparation, etc. So those are the recent policies. Apart from that, in the last 10 or 15 years, based on my observation, in China, the advocacy movement initiated and led by families of children with disability has emphasized on the importance of vocational education and adult transition services for students with disabilities, which also resulted in some favorable policies as well. And based on those documents and advocacies, vocational and transition education in China actually has been, in a very I think perhaps I can say it's the right time for students to do that, because more and more vocational education programs in special education schools has been established, and more regular vocational schools have recruited students with special needs to train them vocational skills. And also in China, we even in special education schools, most of the special education schools is the duration of the candidature is 9 years, based on the 1986 compulsory education law. So most special education schools run a 9-year program, but some of the cities, especially for those cities with more resources. By saying resources, I mean that the economic status is much better in that city, and the local government and the local educational bureau pays more attention to that. They have more and more schools set vocational education programs in those schools. For example, as I said, based on the second round, the National Special Education Promotion Plan in 2017. After that, many cities has introduced the local policy, saying that we will provide a 15-year public education for all students, including those students with disabilities, so which guarantees they have more access to vocational programs in either special education schools or in those regular vocational education schools. That's pretty much the background of what is happening now in China. And in terms of the transition, I think it's very much similar to elsewhere in the world. For students with disabilities, they usually have 3 pathways to go. For example, for some of them, they go to further education. And in China, students with vision impairment or hearing impairment, they can attend the college entrance examination in the first half of the year. And if they would like to go to a college, usually they will have the opportunity to attend higher education. But for students with developmental disabilities, especially for those with intellectual disability, it is very challenging for them to secure a place in a university. And some of the students with intellectual disabilities may obtain employment or community participation. And in terms of the employment in China, we usually have 3 different types of employment formats, and that's what our previous 2 speakers have mentioned: sheltered employment, supported employment, or self-employment. and in recent years, supported employment, or I know in Australia we call it open employment, becomes a main trend in China now, because parents and also other stakeholders, we are now encouraging that students with disabilities should have access to those inclusive employment settings. So that's another trend in China. And self-employment is usually related to some of the students whose families have perhaps a small business, so they can do that as well. They will work with their family members and to be self-employed. And also, some of the special education schools and also regular vocational education schools they have some collaborations with different enterprises or companies to sell some of their products. For example, for students with autism, they may have some hand drawings. And I know several schools, they collaborated with those big companies and sell their products into those companies. And some of the pictures has been printed into the scarves or handbags, etc. So that's another way for doing self-employment as well. And we all know that employment is very essential to all of us. So it can facilitate economic security and personal well-being and productive engagement and social inclusion. So that's also the case in China. I interviewed several parents and also students with disabilities. They all said that employment actually benefited them a lot. And next, I will talk some perhaps only two researches I have done. During my PhD study, and after that, I actually validated the Kohler's taxonomy of transition program in the Chinese context. And we found that Kohler's taxonomy of transition program also match the Chinese settings as well. Also, we need to do some minor modifications about the items. So when we are doing vocational education and also transition education for students with disabilities, we may focus on the student focused planning or person-centered planning to do the vocational transition plans. And also we should focus on students' development to cultivate their capacities in different areas, such as their leisure skills, their self-determined skills, their vocational skills, their interpersonal relationship skills, etc. And also we encourage different agencies or different units to collaborate. And family involvement is also another important thing. And also, how can we seek external support from the government, from the community, from the society? That's also important for us as well. And also, when we are doing transition, so what kind of framework we refer to, or what's our conceptual ideas about it? How should our personnel be prepared, and how should the resources be relocated? Also very important, because I only have 10 minutes, so I will not go to details of it. And another research based on my recent interviews with stakeholders, and it also it is consistent with existing findings that, so when we are doing vocational education, we may focus on vocational skills, because vocational skills is essentially important for them to secure a job. But apart from that, we should also focus on personal skills or personal living skills and social life skills. So an implication of it is that when we are designing vocational education programs or transition planning programs for students with disabilities, we should also focus on their independent living skills and also interpersonal skills. So that's another finding. And we, as per the practices in China, based on the communications with different schools in China, I think I just listed some of the practices maybe promising practices or the so-called evidence-based practices in transition, we should adopt a person-centered approach to do or to develop individualized transition planning. And also we should be market-oriented to localize our training, because China, as you guys know, it's a huge country. So different provinces or different cities may have different resources and different industries. So we should have some market-oriented thinking. And apart from that, the previous two speakers also mentioned self-determination, self-advocacy. That's also very important for students with disabilities when they are trying to get into the employment world. And also the family empowerment, family training, family involvement is also another important way for us to do. And interagency collaboration, for example, special education schools, regular vocational education schools, some local government departments, and the employers, families. If we can, integrate all of them together to facilitate the process, it will help. And also the simulated training or on-site training are essentially important as well. I will show you some pictures and videos immediately after that. And also community-based experiences. I will play a very short video that's car washing training. So actually, this, as we can see from this video, all those students are students with developmental disabilities. This is actually a car washing site. It's not a training. It's the training base. It's also the real working setting. So students with intellectual disabilities and autism, they obtained their car washing skills on the site, and they know how to communicate with the customers and how to collaborate with the peers as well. And we go to the next one. So that's room service training. So actually, this lady is the employee of the hotel, and she sometimes go to his school and to do some training, to do simulated training as well. But after he obtained the basic skills, the school will place him in the real setting to practice his skills. So that's another way we are doing. And also, that's the laundry services. So it's the same. As we can see, this boy tries to do quicker because his payment is related to how many towels he did every day. So it's also the training and also employment base as well. And I will show several different pictures. That's another special education school with the vocational programs set in 1992, and they have a cafe attached to their school, so we can see some of their training pictures. So that's the student who are trying to serve the customs, and that's the other pictures. So that's pretty much what I would like to share with you. Some of the references are listed here as well, and this is my contact details. I appreciate this opportunity to communicate with you guys. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tim. You gave us such a good overview, and a lot of cases from China. So that's all for the situational report from the 4 countries: Thailand, Australia, Ireland, and China. So now I would like to move forward to the specific questions of each of you. So first of all, I would like to ask all of you, starting from representative from Thailand. So the question is, in your country, what's the main policy to promote education for career of students with special needs? Okay, so in your country, what's the main policy to promote education for career of students with special needs? Okay, so first of all I would like to ask คุณสวรักษ์ so มีpolicy อะไรที่สำคัญสำหรับประเทศไทยบ้างครับเชิญเลยครับจะตอบเป็นภาษาไทยก็ได้ใช่ไหมครับ
มีเวลาคนละกี่นาทีอ่ะ
คนละไม่เกินประมาณ3 นาทีครับไม่เกิน5 นาทีครับเชิญเลยครับ
โอเคค่ะyeah I will answer this question in English but I
Okay.
don't have any slides but I will read from the paper okay Actually, the Persons with Disability Act stated that persons with disability are entitled to education as set forth in the legislations on the national education or the national education plans. The acts ensure that the rights of persons with disability to education. However, the education for persons with disability can take place in a specific educational institutes or general education institutes. So although the education for persons with disability can be formal educations or non-formal educations, but however, the Thai government approved the Adult Educational for Persons with Disability Act in 2008. The act stated that the persons with disability have the rights to education as following: the first one, free education from birth, or from when disability occurs until the end of life, with the educational technologies.
Hello.
And also there, the act also highlight to the education standard, including the curriculum, instructions, assessments, and the other appropriate means of education according to the type of impairments. And also in 2017, Thai government also announced the National Education Plan for the year of 2017 to 2036. The plan sets 5 major goals to be achieved by the year 2036, one of which is that all persons in Thailand have access to a quality education which meets the education standard. An indicator for the success. The goals is that the persons who have age between 6 to 14 years access to free primary and lower secondary education, and all persons with disability are given appropriate educational services. In addition, the plan adopts the 4 educational concepts, including education for all, inclusive education, and sufficiency economy, and all for education for all. But however, they are still have the regulations and like policy on the regular school in Thailand. And in here in Thailand, the compulsory education includes 6 years of primary education and 3 years of the lower secondary educations. The compulsory education in Thailand is free in the public education institutions. The Thai government also has a policy to promote access to 3 years of early childhood education and 3 years of upper secondary education for general Thai students. However, as the early childhood educations and upper secondary educations are not compulsory, it can be challenging to ensure access for students with disability to education in regular settings. So there are actually three main types of school in Thailand: the Ministry of Education school, local administration schools, and private schools. And however, the number of students with disability in regular school in Thailand increase substantially, every year. But the most public regular school in Thailand that accept students with disability are called integrations, not inclusive school. They call integration schools rather than inclusive school. The integration school varies in how they accommodate students with disabilities. In most integration schools, students with disability attend one of the following: full-time specific classroom, regular classroom for parts of the day, and special classroom for parts of the day, or full-time regular classroom. So special education teachers have responsibility in preparing students with disability for regular classrooms and to work with regular teachers in transferring students with disability to regular classroom. However, some students with disability in regular school in Thailand attend special classroom full-time, although or through school and participates only in extracurricular activities with regular students. Yeah, for instance. Thank you.
โอเคครับ thank you so much
For any challenge, I will talk later. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much for the case of Thailand about the policy that you already highlighted. So for Australia, I'm sure that Professor Eva, you have talked about that in your slide, but could you please highlight it again?
Of course, I can highlight it again. Just give me 1 second and I'll share the PowerPoint. So the main educational policy that is relevant to students with disability across all stages of schooling are disability standards for education, and that's the national policy. And that really highlights in different areas of education, be it curriculum, be it participation, that the students with disability have to have the same opportunities. The phrase used is on the same basis as their peers who do not have disability, and that applies to different aspects of education and would apply also to vocational training. But transition is more specifically mentioned in many Australian governmental or specifically New South Wales, where I work. So that would be the context by different policies and strategy guidance documents. And some of the key ones are, first of all, the inclusive education statement for students with disability, which for the first time really articulates how New South Wales Department of Education understands what inclusive education is. And there is a really big highlight on students' agency and self-determination development, including across the transitioning to post-school life. Another really key document is School Excellence Framework, which does highlight the support students during the transitions across their different learning stages, highlights that it's really necessary to start transitioning as early as possible, what are the school's expectations, but also commitments. What is really great about this framework for me personally is also it really highlights high expectations of all students. And that is something that hasn't always been the practice before. So yeah, this would be some very key documents that I would highlight.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, for the highlighted policy that you already mentioned. So now we move to Ireland, please.
Yes, thank you. So I didn't present all of the legislation that exists in Ireland because the legislation is really driven by strategies. And it is the strategies that are much more important in many cases than the legislation. However, what does govern our students with special educational needs is the bill called the Education of Persons with Special Educational Needs Act, EPSN, and this was enacted in 2004. But not all aspects have been enacted. So, for example, a student is not entitled to an individual education plan, although it is considered best practice universally. However, it does determine, for example, that a child is entitled to an assessment of need and support identified as a result of that assessment of need. Thereby, the choice about whether you go to a special school or a mainstream school is very much up to parents. It is driven by the parent at that stage. And what we find particularly is that because not all schools and you know, a little bit like other areas, you know, all schools have different ways of working and functioning with students, and it's not every student with special needs that they will say perhaps is suited to be in a mainstream school. But let's flip that around actually and consider actually it's not every school that considers, you know, the whole notion of having students with special needs suitable for them. So there's, while, you know, we can have all the legislation that we want and we can have all the strategy that we want, but the reality on the ground is that there's a huge gap between policy and practice. And, you know, we have had to enact in Ireland a specific aspect of our Disability Act that would mandate that schools must take a certain amount of students with special needs. So, and depending on what area of Ireland that you live in, etc., that also determines what's available. So, you know, for example, if you live in a rural area, your access is much more reduced. So the legislation is there as a framework, but there are huge gaps in it, like every other country. I don't know any country that doesn't have gaps in between policy and practice. I will say that there is a huge drive at the moment, as I did announce there earlier, a huge drive to change that situation, and you know, moving towards non-segregated settings is the priority, and that has to start as early as preschool. So we don't have segregated settings really for preschool unless the child would have very complex needs, and there arises more problems because you are considered under the EPSN Act until you are 18. Then you move into the Disability Act, because until you're 18, you're in the legal school system, and then your needs are then looked after by the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Health. So that interagency collaboration that's been highlighted by both my other colleagues on the panel is critical here. It's crucial for transition. If we're not all at the same table and talking to each other, well, then this transition is not going to happen and it's not going to be sustained. So, you know, while we, you know, the legislation can protect, can provide a framework for it, but I will say that it is the strategies, both of which I have presented to you today, is really what's informing and driving policy in Ireland at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Then we move to our speaker from China, please. The main policy.
Yes, sure. I'm also sharing my screen now as well. As I just talked with my PowerPoint that, you know, I will go just from one by one. I just mentioned that the protection law on individuals with disability, this was introduced in 2008. Actually, this is consistent with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities introduced by the UN. So in terms of the protection, it covers education, rehabilitation, employment, and other areas as well. So as a parent or as other stakeholders, they will ask, how should my child get employed? So I think that's one important law. And apart from that, the amendment of the regulations on education for individuals with disabilities, when it was amended in 2017, it has a separate chapter on vocational education. And this chapter clearly stipulates that all cities or district, as long as the district with a population of more than 300,000, it should have a school, either a special education school with vocational education programs or a regular school to provide vocational education services for students with disabilities. So this is very important, and also the promotion plans. For example, as I played the video of car washing, so actually the video comes from a special education school in a special education in the southeast part of China. Before 2018, each year the school can can select students who can go to vocational education programs, and each year they only recruit 30 or 40 students. But after the second round of the National Special Education Promotion Plan has been introduced, the local second round special education promotion plan was also introduced, and within the local city, the writing is that as long as the student and the family would like to go to a vocational program, we should provide it to them. So in 2018, the number, raised from 30 to 40 to almost 300. So I think those plans, those regulations, and those policies plays a very important role in secure vocational education for students with disabilities. So that's pretty much I would like to say.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to continue to the second question, starting from Dr. Tim, because you already mentioned about this, and I would like to ask a question continuously. So we talk about policy already, and actually Dr. Geraldine also mentioned that the challenging part is how to convert from policy to practices. So I would like to ask each of you, but starting from Dr. Tim first, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge to bring policies into practice in your country?
Okay, thank you, Jess. Based on my understanding, especially, I'm trying to relate it into the Chinese context. As I just mentioned, we used to have 9-year compulsory education. So for teachers with special education training background may or may not qualified to be a vocational education teacher. So I think the first challenge is qualified professional teachers to deliver vocational education services to students with disabilities. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is, perhaps also the stakeholders' expectations. Also, we have policies there, but in several cities in China, the parents may choose not to send their child into the vocational program because they think if we send the students into the vocational program, hey, their child might get employed, and if they get employed, they may get bullied as well. So it's kind of, the parents or the stakeholders, if they have some, different expectations, it will affect the policy's implication. And the third challenge is that, as I said, if we wanted to implement the policy, actually, the financial conditions and the human resources, etc., is very important to support the system. If the city is not, the city doesn't have sufficient financial resources to recruit or to relocate relevant resources, it's also different. It's also difficult as well. So yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We move to Ireland. Dr. Geraldine, what is the biggest challenge to transform policy to practice?
Okay, so the first big challenge is really the attitudes of people with regards to what they view people with disabilities as a stereotype. So trying to break down that stereotypical view of a person with disability, particularly with intellectual disability and complex needs. And taking those attitudes then and moving then both into the school, starting at early childhood education and right through up to further and higher education. So actually challenging that notion, but also supporting staff in order to change their views. And we know through research that the biggest barrier to inclusion is the attitudes of educators. So educators really do need to be supported across all realms. Also, I would say that it is also their moral obligation to actually engage with, 21st century principles of how we envisage people to be and to participate in society. When we talk about employers, we would have a lot of, I suppose, programs that does support employers. We have an agency called the National Disability Authority, and they provide instruction, and support to employers as well. But we need more of that. We need more, employers engaging at that level. The second one is political will. It's to have the political will and ambition to actually make the principles that underpin the UNCRPD happen. And if the political will isn't there, it's not going to happen at the end of the day. We've already seen that, for example, in China, there's huge advocacy from parents. It's the same in Ireland. I'm sure it's the same in Australia. Why do we have to advocate so much for our children with special needs in order to get there to progress their rights? And the last big challenge here in Ireland is, and actually is probably the singular challenge, is the collaboration between the agencies. So again, we noticed that in the other presentations, interagency collaboration is critical. To get people all at the table at the same time is a challenge. And also having that will in order to progress that, and what that involves. But the key aspect here is research. We're all researchers here, and evidence of what works has become to actually impact in Ireland on overcoming that challenge. So my own research is actually actively being used at government at level in order to reimagine that transition policy and what that's going to look like and to develop it. So while there are challenges there will always be those challenges. There are ways to circumvent and to work with those challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So move to Australia.
Of course. My response to this question will be probably very similar as the response that was given by my colleagues from China and Ireland. When I was thinking about this question, I remembered already mentioned here the transition taxonomy for transitioning programming, which in the Colors taxonomy there are 5 main areas identified, and I know it was adapted for China, but I will work with this model, and I can see the very many issues basically in each area of this circle. So Geraldine, you mentioned the interagency collaboration. That is absolutely true, and a big obstacle in Australia as well. I think what would also help if there would be a clear policy that would articulate who has responsibility for those, for what. I will give one small example. In one of our research studies, we found out that there is a real problem even with transition between primary and secondary school. And when you talk to the secondary school teachers, they were saying, well, we expect that the primary school teacher will contact us when the child is transitioning. And the primary school teachers were telling us, well, we expect to be contacted by the high school teachers. So at the end, nobody contacts no one, and there is limited transfer of information between the level. That's just one of many examples. But then if you have a clear legislation and duties articulated, then that could be overcome. I have mentioned in my presentation definitely the issue with students being empowered to have a voice about their education, about their career choices, about their future, being really actively, being supported to be actively involved in developing their learning and transition plans, including those with intellectual disability and autism, which are often forgotten. There is definitely there are big gaps when it comes to family engagement, and these issues could be from both sides, be it school or be it the actual parents who might be overwhelmed, exhausted, just don't have capacity and energy and to continue with some more elaborate collaboration with the school. Of course, there are issues with teachers training, and I do agree with it was also a point made by Geraldine that teachers need to be trained and supported in what are the best practices in supporting students during the transitions. I would argue that all teachers should have a knowledge about this. So yeah, I could continue there, but the issues are very similar to what have been mentioned already.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, move to Thailand. Hello.
ค่ะได้ยินไหม
ครับ please.
Everyone here, do you hear me?
Yes,
clearly?
yes, yes, please.
Yeah. Actually, I think the main challenge is how to identify the key challenges or key barriers in social model perspectives. When we want to implement inclusive education or transitional inclusive education for persons with disability in all settings, we have to be ensured that we could identify either persons with disability and its impairments and the barrier in society, like physically barrier in access to information and communication and technologies, barrier in accessing the assistive devices and assistive technologies, and although the stigma or attitudinal barriers. So if we could not identify them, based on social model, it means that if we could not change, tip the paradigm from charity and medical-based approach to social models, the education would be, prioritized to specific measure like specific educations, and the transitional education system would be specific for persons with disability in specific area. But nowadays, the universals, or international perceptions promotes inclusive educations or education in the regular or mainstream school, and also to promote work and employability in open labor market rather than in special or specific market. And the other challenge is how to identify or determine areas in which students with disability needs additional support. Without the first, without the first one, that to identify the challenges and medical models in terms of medical-based approach, practitioners or policymakers could not be able to identify to determine the areas of the appropriate support to students with disability. And the third one, I think the analysis differentiates between the inclusive dimensions of the educational processes from the perspectives of teachers, as well as from the perspective of students in mainstream primary schools. And also the students with disability still need more support in all educational processes, as well as support in the developing appropriate relationship with their peers include their peer in the same classmate or in the other regular setting. Yeah. For
Okay.
short.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so now I would like to move to the question from the floor. I've got some questions from the floor. So let's and for this round, I will not like ask every one of you. If any one of you want to answer the question, yeah, please give me a signal. I'm not going to ask like one by one. Okay, so I've got a very interesting question from the floor. The question is, the ITP or individualized transition plan in your country, okay, talking about this, is it separated? Is ITP separated from the IEP, which is individualized educational program? So it is included or separated with, okay, the second one is, when the students with disabilities will start to receive the ITP, okay, when the students with disabilities will start to receive ITP. Okay, Eva, you would like to answer first, right? Yes,
definitely. With non-existing legislation that would stipulate exactly this, it is really very various and depends on school. So in some schools there will be individual learning plan for students. In some schools you wouldn't even have that. In some schools you would have both plans or integrated into one. And again, with the age of the individual learning plan, often depends on how good advocates the parents are of the child, which shouldn't be really up to them.
Okay, Geraldine, please.
Yes, so the program that I presented to you, the supported transition model, like Iva has said there, it's not part of national policy, but in that program they start the transition program when the child is about 13 or 14. So they started very, very early, because with many different types of people with different types of disabilities, it may take longer to raise those aspirations, etc. Again, the IEPs are not mandated, so therefore they're not used. And an IEP is very, very different to a transition plan, completely different. So I would never, I haven't come across it even anywhere else in any other country where they would be combined.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Tim, please.
Yes, I just want to add, in China, we actually has national curriculum standards introduced in 2019 for different types of students with disabilities. So with those national curriculums, we also have incorporated the vocational awareness training courses. So based on some of the documents in China, we encourage the students to do IEP, but also we encourage the teachers to incorporate some of the such as vocational awareness training into some of the courses. I would say in China, perhaps IEP is somewhat contains ITP, but as the child grows older, it will focus more on the vocational domains or transition to adult role domains.
Okay, thank you. Kun Sawalak, would you like to add on something?
Yeah. Actually, as I am promoting inclusive education, so education in regular school, for the individual transition programs should be, according to human rights perspective and social model perspective. So the individual transition programs should be considered under the individual decision. So therefore, before having the individual transition programs, that persons with disability need to be a support system for decision making. My question is to all experts. Do we consider having or any progressive realizations to have support decision making to children with disability in all settings to design the best interest for them according to making the individual transition programs? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I would like to move on to, actually, I've got a lot of questions. So let's see, like how many questions that we can answer together. Okay, so the next one, they would like to ask about, as educator and researchers in education for special needs, is there any way that we can support companies or organizations when they want to get like children with special needs to work with them? Because many times we see that there are some places, there are some organizations that they have potential, but they don't know how to start and they don't know how to, like work with people with special needs. So for us, how can we support them? I mean, like companies or organizations or, restaurants or any center who want to start to work with people with special needs. Okay, anyone want to start first? Okay, Dr. Geraldine, please.
Okay, so within the program that we've developed, the career employment facilitator is your link here. So this is the person that works with the employer literally on a one-to-one basis in the same way that they work with the student. And they build up that relationship between them because, as you have already, as the person that has suggested there is willingness there from employers to engage with students with disabilities, but they need to know how. And many of them are afraid, or they're afraid that they'll say the wrong thing or they'll use the wrong language. Let me give you an example. One of our participants in our project was working in a shop, and she came home from work that day, and her mum asked her how she got on, and she got quite upset. And she said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I didn't go to the bathroom all day, and I didn't have a break all day." Nobody told the child that where the bathroom was, what time she should go on lunch, and where you and I might have those skills to be able to actually readily engage and say, "Oh, by the way, where's the bathroom?" All of that. They didn't. And when the employer realized this, they actually developed a mentorship program within their area, and that has become a core part of the program, so that the employer mentor, appoints somebody as mentee of the young person coming in. The real big challenge here is that it has to be individual. You can't say what will work with one will work with another, and that is the challenge of diversity. So therefore, as a result of those challenges, you do have to be willing to be able to be flexible. I think I've spoke about that flexibility in that program has to be there in order to be able to engage with. So I would say just, knock on the door, have the conversation and take it from there.
Okay, thank you so much. Move to Ms. Sawalak, please.
Yes. But actually, your Mr. Moderators, your questions already show the pain points of the business. I mean, they don't know how to deal with disability. So to resolve the pain point, if they don't know, we have to give them educations and training, right? So normally, regularly, for international perception, we start to recommend business firms to have disability equality trainings. It is the training provides the leading process, sensitivity to the business firms from decision maker, from the decision maker, administrative levels to staffing levels to understand, to really think about disability, to of reluctance to engage with persons with disability. At the same time, we have to prepare persons with disability as well to give them similar training on disability equality, to give them a proud or to be persons with disability, to have, living with disabilities. Secondly, the program related to welcoming disability in workplace should be, implemented. It is already clear with the best practices from international labor organizations. There are to show up that when we have a trend in different, concerning to the first step is disability equality, it is sensitivity training. But the second, welcoming disability in workplace, talking about barriers. If you remember that I talked about the inclusive disability in society activity, we have to break down or remove 4 barriers according to the definitions of disability according to CRPD. We have to break down attitudinal, negative, bad attitudinal or negative or stigma. And also we have to break down the other built environments barrier, like physically barriers, access, limitations of access to information communication barriers, and also the regulations of business firms that prevent persons with disability to be able to full participation and to show up their best performance. At the same time, we have similar training to persons with disability, namely the job seekers with disabilities. It is, contents of the perspective all needed for persons with disability to prepare themselves to understand the open labor market and also business firms in the realities, because all persons with disability, or most of them, lack of, socialized skills and also understanding relevant to open labor market and business. So we have to, provide them this kind of knowledge. And the regulation related to employment has to be integrated or harmonized, from the social development ministry to labor ministries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Tim, please.
Yes, I just would like to add, a colleague of mine in China, he actually organized trainings regularly for employers or for companies. What he usually do is that he usually provide success cases to potential employers who would like to hire individuals with disabilities, to convince them to reduce their concern about potential issues or problems with hiring an individual with disability. And secondly, he will provide some training to the employer and also the co-workers about some of the such as communication strategies with students with different types of disability. For example, how to communicate with a person with hearing impairment, or how to deal with emotional, or just very briefly or very simply, how to deal with behavior problems for students with autism, etc. So just like to illustrate the employers and also the co-workers about potential problems or performances that individuals with disabilities might have. And also, in addition to that, he and his team also do some trainings about the policy, because some of the policy in China, if the employers do not have a fully understand about the policy, the employer might need to pay the fine to based on the quotas system for employment. And if the employer can hire someone with disability, the employer may get some incentives from the local government and other departments as well. So just that's pretty much what we are doing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I truly agree with you that well, all of the stakeholders have to be prepared and get ready. Their people with disabilities themselves, companies, organizations, and the government also give incentive to their organizations as well. Okay, now I would like to move to the next question, which is I personally found this very interesting. So I'm going to ask you about the career of people with disabilities in 21st century, okay? Because right now we are facing many challenges, COVID-19, okay? Technology disruption, okay? Because, well, so far, the jobs that the people with disabilities are doing, like cleaning, like being an operator, like call center, or like cleaning or working in a restaurant, this can be replaced by AI or machine or robots, right? Okay, and next, globalization. After COVID-19 situation, we will see a lot of influx, and people migrated from one country to another country. So globalization, COVID-19, and technological disruption will all affect career development of people with disabilities in the future. So I would like to ask you, when we look at all of these challenges or maybe opportunities, okay, so what are the perspective of career of people with disabilities in the 21st century? Okay, so I think this is very interesting question. Okay, so who's gonna answer first? Okay, Dr. Geraldine, please.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, so let me flip it a little bit for you. For years and years, people with disabilities have been looking for flexible hours, have been looking for work, being able to work from home, being able to work remotely, not having to be present, but also have a huge amount of skills that can be harnessed as working from home. So we just have a paper in for review at the moment on this very issue around the work that we did in 2015, because the biggest thing that people were looking for was flexibility. So now we see that, it is possible for a whole country to operate with people working remotely. So therefore, for an awful lot of people, particularly those who are physically disabled, and who also have mental health issues and energy issues or autoimmune problems, etc. It's feasible for. The piece about EI is really, really challenging for all of us. I don't necessarily think it's only challenging for, people with disabilities. I think it's really exciting in many ways, because hopefully we would have more time in our hands to actually enjoy our lives. But I think with EI, and I've attended quite a lot here in Ireland around it, because we have a fantastic unit in DCU that does a lot of research with EI, and I'm embedded in ethics, so we're always looking at the ethical implications of these type of things. And I think really at this stage, it's still very, very early to determine what that might look like. But I think, again, it will be to the advantage of people with disabilities more so than it will be to the advantage of you or me who don't have a disability, because we function in a completely different way. So, in many ways, the 21st century way of developing your career trajectory won't only affect people with disabilities. It's going to affect, I have younger family members here. It will affect them as well, But I do think that actually COVID has done us quite, has highlighted how skills can be honed in on and how you can actually build on those skills and working from home. Not everybody has to be present in the office, to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Any one of you want to share your ideas with this question? I think this is very interesting question. Okay. Anyone?
I definitely agree that it's very, very interesting question. And I think if I move a bit beyond even COVID, I just think there need to be much more higher expectations of what people with disabilities can do. So far, if they find job, and I will be looking now particularly at people with intellectual disability, which is my focus, then which is very rare, then it will be stereotypically being employed in position such as helping in McDonald's or in a cleaning service and etc. And I think we don't work already with the high school students to encourage them and to have the bigger expectations of their lives and vision for it. For this group of students, we don't really focus the transition planning on post-school education. It's more like work. Why couldn't they study? Why couldn't they go to university? And we know that is already starting to happen. Why couldn't they be researchers? And that's why I love the inclusive research that has taken off from UK. Jen Walmsley coined the term in 2003, and it's really happening. I work very intensively with co-researchers who have intellectual disability and work in this role. So I think there just needs to be much more high expectations because they can do it. We are the ones who put the limits on them.
Okay, thank you. Kunstawalak, please.
I would say that there are no particular suitable jobs, work, or employment for anybody, including persons with or without disabilities. Everyone should have opportunity to choose what they want to do. For instance, they should have a choice to study. I should have choice to study in any educations, to build my abilities, right? To create my professional career, to create my professional path. Yeah, anybody, include persons with disability. So therefore, the answer go back to human resource development. Education is very important. How do we design inclusive educational system, which allows persons with different identity to be able to choose and to practice and develop their skill to meet the circumstance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. So I think we're gonna move to the last question. Since we have talked a lot about research, so what are the trend or perspective of the research about people with disabilities in education, of course, in the future? So what do you think? Like what kind of area or what kind of research that should be done in the future in our field? Okay, this is the last question. Okay, Dr. Jaredin, please.
I think we need to move towards participatory research with, facilitating the voice of people with disabilities. The mantra, nothing for us without us, is the universal cry from a lot of the literature, particularly in Disability and Society, the Journal for Disability and Society. And really, we're all sitting here talking about people with disabilities and vocational education. We don't have somebody here with disability from vocational education. And that's quite telling in some ways, because we feel that we have the right in many ways to discuss about all of these different types of things without having their voice at the table. And we all do it, it's done all of the time. That is changing. And if we're really to realize the vision of the UN CRPD, that's where research needs to go. It needs to be led, developed, interrogated, evaluated by them, for them, and not necessarily with our assistance. We could do it with their assistance, but most definitely that is the way. Practitioner research is very good. We're all academics. That's what we do every day. But actually, the program that I presented to you there was completely embedded in pupil voice. All of the material that was developed for that program comes from the students, and that's where research. That is the future of research in disability studies, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, anyone want to add on the research perspective in the future? Okay.
I recommend the comparative research of the implementations of education at country level with the standard, the universal standard like CRPD and other educational standard. And the second comparative research is about the quality of maybe employability for persons with disability. I mean, between persons who study in special school or specific schools and who graduate from regular or mainstream schools. This is to show up. I don't want to stigma that, but we want the result to show up that why we have to promote inclusive education and work and employment in an open labor market. Thank you.
Okay.
I would like to add one point here.
Yes.
In terms of research, if we go back to see the literature, at least to the best of my knowledge, I think as a researcher, most of the literatures may focus on what is happening now, the current situation, what are the challenges, and then we may propose the potential strategies. But the potential strategies, whether it is feasible, whether it is effective, so nobody knows. So I think perhaps we need more practice-based research to enable or to facilitate the development of employment transition for students with disabilities. And we also need to localize, to do some customized practice-based training, practice-based research. So that's my point of view.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think that's all for our session, which is very fruitful. I can see a lot of experiences. I can see a lot of lessons learned from the 4 countries that have been shared here, and it seems like our listeners also pay a lot of attention to our session. So very fruitful, and thank you so much. So last but not least, on behalf of the organizer, I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists, Ms. Sawarak Thongkui, Professor Eva Stradova, Assistant Professor Geraldine Scanlon, Associate Professor Tai Si Su. Okay, thank you so much. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Goodbye.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to meet you all.
Bye.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Okay.
ขอกราบขอบพระคุณนะคะท่านวิทยากรนะคะแล้วก็ดร.เจษฎาสาราทองโมเดเรเตอร์ของเราด้วยค่ะสำหรับวันนี้ค่ะโครงการของเราค่ะการจัดงานประชุมวิชาการระดับนานาชาตินะคะด้านสายอาชีพการศึกษาเพื่อทุกคนเปลี่ยนความต้องการพิเศษเป็นพลังเพื่อสังคมแห่งการอยู่ร่วมกันก็ได้เสร็จสิ้นลงแล้วค่ะขอบคุณทุกท่านมากๆเลยนะคะที่เข้ามาอยู่กับเราตั้งแต่เช้าจนถึงเวลา 16 นาฬิกานี้ค่ะทุกช่องทางเลยนะคะทั้ง Facebook YouTube และโปรแกรม Zoom ค่ะวันนี้ดิฉันต้องขอตัวลาไปก่อนขอบพระคุณค่ะ
เปลี่ยนความต้องการพิเศษเป็นพลังเพื่อสังคมแห่งการอยู่ร่วมกัน